Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, debt slayers, peasants, vassals. I'm a useful idiot. Welcome, and let's go back to Iraq because that's how I roll. Let's talk about the Iraqi army. Well, they suck, and I'm sorry if I've offended anybody by saying that, but the Iraqi army, after well over a decade of U.S. training and equipping, uh, completely sucks. And we saw evidence, of course, of that in the field several years ago when a force of some 30,000 Iraqi soldiers fled Mosul in light of some several thousand jihadi fighters from ISIS. And not only did they abandon equipment, they abandoned their uniforms. And so we got a taste of what the United States has created in Iraq. And there's no surprise there if you trace back the history of the United States involvement of this presumptuous attitude that they were going to go in there and create an army. And certainly, at least the way they went about creating an army was doomed to fail from the beginning. And so first we go to the fact that the original Iraqi army, of course, was decimated in the last war. And then when the United States took over, one of the biggest flaws that was ever perpetrated in the reconstruction of Iraq and sealing its fate in the future was when Bremer took over and disbanded the then existing Iraqi army. I still think it's one of the greatest tragedies of our entire involvement in Iraq as far as being an effective force in Iraq while the United States was there and after we left. And and apparently it doesn't take much of a military expert to figure that out, because I figured it out when it happened. So I assume that our best and brightest in the Pentagon could figure out that is what would happen. The disbanding of that force turned out to be a fatal flaw, and it's almost like they wished for the repercussions that happened afterwards. And the reason why we say it's a failure is because, first of all, it released over 300,000 ex-military men into Iraq unemployed at a very dangerous time in the evolution of that state. And the other thing is they already had they were already a fighting force that had gotten used to its own units, its own commanders, its own structure, its own loyalties, and its own cohesion. And that could have gone a long way in making sure that Iraq held together after the war ended, or at least combat operations in the initial phase were over. So what a fatal flaw that was, and of course now we end up with an army that's conscripts, that's all across the board as far as who is in the military, as long as it isn't, as long as ex-Ba'athist, and of course Ba'athist is exactly what they need. And it's interesting that the United States military could collaborate with ex-Nazis after World War II, but for some reason find it distasteful to collaborate with ex-Baathists in Iraq. And then it's kind of funny to see that the United States goes into Iraq thinking they're going to build a force of 40,000, a police force for that country, and then the number, of course, over the years went up to 100,000 to 400,000, and now the United States claims to have trained over 950,000 security forces for Iraq. And certainly it's reflective of the deteriorating security situation there over the years, and sectarian violence and continued wars, but also it just reflects the naivete of the planners that went into Iraq. And so anyway, so now we have, and also one of the things that's a tragedy about this whole situation with the Iraqi army is that for bureaucracy and for kissing ass and hierarchies, we have a constant stream of praise over the years. So one commander after another, one trainer after another, one government after another, one president and Congress after another, talking about all the progress that's been made in Iraq and how capable the forces are there. And then, of course, when push comes to shove, it all turns out to be lies, and they've been bullshitting all along. And we have historical precedents. Of course, the same thing happened in Vietnam. Everybody wanted to get out of Vietnam. So, yeah, sure, this huge South Vietnamese army that's one of the most well-armed in the world when we leave will be more than capable of taking care of the job, and of course folded within mere months and years. So this idea of building native armies, it's a great moneymaker. That's the one thing. The military-industrial complex loves it because it's a great moneymaker, however things turn out. But as far as American foreign policy, it's a failure. And one of the other reasons the Iraqi army sucks is because there's apparently somewhere around 50,000, maybe even 100,000 ghost soldiers, and those are soldiers who do not exist. They only exist on paper. And perhaps a lot of people out there have heard about the scandals where the officers still continue to collect the checks of soldiers who don't show up, or soldiers just sit at home and collect their checks and are really only soldiers on paper. Not hard to believe. I'm sure the bureaucracy over there has a lot of holes in it. But another thing about the Iraqi army, why they suck, is because they're just not motivated. And as Andrew Bosovich, a great military observer and analyst, talked about, he said, quote, "It may be time to admit that there's no Iraq," unquote. And that's part of the problem now that we have this this cosmopolitan army in Iraq made up of all different people through all sectors of their society. It really doesn't represent a fighting force that is very motivated in the field. And that's another reason we've seen a lot of these mass exits and retreats by Iraqi forces and hardly putting up a fight. And then another part we could have predicted all along too is all these training put in place, and all these facilities that the United States built were built by an army that was already used to its own system, plus all the new people that were brought in. So once the United States left, the training went to pot because it wasn't really necessary or appropriate for that military, perhaps, to model it after the United States. And then, of course, the facilities themselves also deteriorated, and a lot of that is due to contractor work that was a fraud and a ripoff of the U.S. military and the American taxpayer as well. So now we look at the fact that the United States has spent somewhere between 25 and 100 billion dollars on the Iraqi military over the last decade or so, and continues to pour more money into it. But of course, once again, it's a windfall for the military-industrial complex, however much it might be a failure for the U.S. Foreign policy in that region. So anyway, what are the implications of the fact that the Iraqi army sucks? Oh, let me add the fact that we're going to see a real test of the Iraqi army, because now there is an assault on Mosul apparently is being planned. It's going to be spearheaded by Iraqi forces in the south, and then an attack by the Kurds from the north. And then there's also this recent assault on Ramadi, but that's been completely overplayed. As we know, United States air support was the greatest part of a victory, and only a very small section of Ramadi and Anbar has been recovered, and apparently the Iraqi army only fared so well in the field. But anyway, so the implications of the fact that the Iraqi army sucks is one of the reasons why it's likely we could see a confrontation between Kurdistan and Iraq would probably lose. It's hard to imagine that they could put any real military pressure on Kurdistan, all things considered. And the fact that the Iraqi army sucks is one of the reasons why I would imagine we're going to continue to see Iraq fragment, and it's going to be hard for them to displace ISIS without much more significant help. And part of the problem with that as well is the best part of the army, of course, is held back in Baghdad. And with the fact that the Iraqi army sucks is another reason why we're going to see much more war to come in that region. And there's going to be a lot of Iraqi soldiers that are going to die because the Iraqi army sucks. And so what we'll end up with in the end is the garrison in Baghdad, because of course the very cherry-picked part of the Iraqi army, the best equipped, the best trained, the best armed, the most loyal, are going to be held in reserve in Baghdad to protect the government, the weasels in the government. And that's how it works. So there'll be all the cannon fodder in the field. And another reason why we're going to continue to see some Iraqi military failures in the field, and why the Iraqi army will continue to suck. But too bad we had to pay for it here in the United States. But at least we only paid with our treasure, while the poor Iraqis are paying for it with their blood in the deserts of Iraq. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.